VACCHO acknowledges this podcast is created on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to Wurundjeri elders of yesterday, today and tomorrow, and extend those respects to all traditional owners across the country where we live and work. Hi everyone, welcome to VACCHO's podcast Strong Voice, where we explore cultural safety in personal and professional contexts. And each week we have a deadly guest speaker and a new host. My name is Rebecca. I'm a proud Yorta Yorta woman and the manager of cultural safety services here at VACCHO, and I am joined today by Jill Gallagher, a proud and strong Gunditjmara woman, the former treaty commissioner and VACCHO's current CEO. How you going, Aunt?
I'm good, Beck. How are you?
I'm better now.
Yeah, that's good. That's deadly.
I've got a really important question for you before we start.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's real serious.
All right.
Can I have a raise?
Now, that I have to check, all right? I have to see how many of these you do and how well you do.
Oh, right, yep.
Okay.
So we're going to talk today about, I guess, the meaning of cultural safety, the definition of cultural safety and why it's important. And I was thinking that because in our culture we like to know where we've been and know where we've come from so we know where we're going, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just starting off with give us a bit of a yarn about your journey or your trajectory to becoming VACCHO CEO.
Okay, love to. Thank you, Beck. And as Beck has already introduced me, my name is Jill Gallagher. And I am a very proud Gunditjmara woman, and I am currently the CEO of VACCHO. And some of the work that I did when I took 2.5 years off to do the treaty advancement role was amazing. So, and I might get to talk a little bit about that later. But anyways, we'll see what it is. So my journey to the CEO of VACCHO, well, like many, I come from a very large family, Beck. My mum, who is 96 years old, she's still alive, and she currently resides at one of our amazing services, ACES, which is a Aboriginal aged care specialist service. So mum loves it there. But mum grew up in an era that wasn't very safe to be in, by the way. My mother was born in 1926, so she was born into her country where she wasn't counted in the census. And believe it or not, so was I. I was born in 1955, and so we weren't recognised as citizens of this country until the 1967 referendum.
Yes.
As you would know.
Yes. So
that's just a little bit of historical information about my mum. When my mum was a young woman, the only source of employment she could get was mainly working as a seasonal picker. And that's like many Aboriginal people from her era. So we grew up all over Gunai country, believe it or not. For those who don't know, that's Gippsland. And we followed the seasons. Picking beans was our favourite because that was the easiest. Potatoes and onions was a bit hard. But as a result of that moving around, because we had to follow the employment opportunities, and then I went to something like 19 different primary schools. Yeah, even though looking back on my early years, I think I was very rich. To actually live in a tent and live with the mob and camp by the river and go to school from there. So from there we migrated to Wurundjeri country when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I've been here on Wurundjeri country ever since. Which, for those who don't know, which is Melbourne. Anyway, so I went to school here, George Street Primary School, and went to Fitzroy Girls High School. Left there when halfway between year 7. I was 13, and we had to get back then special exemptions to leave school before 15, which we did, and I worked in factories most of my young life. I became a young mum at the age of 17, and lived in Fitzroy. But as I got older, I saw the need for Aboriginal people to have a strong voice.
Yep.
There is, I mean, we have been disempowered for so long, 250 years of colonisation, and we're still fighting for a voice to Parliament.
Yes.
I mean, anyways, the mind boggles.
Yes, it does.
So I knew then that when I left school, I wanted to go back to school and learn. I wanted to be able to have a strong voice, but not just a strong voice in white fella education, if I can put it that way.
Yep.
And I don't mean any disrespect with that language. But I also knew how important it was to have a black fella education.
Absolutely. And you didn't leave school because of any other reason other than you needed to financially provide for the family.
Help,
right?
support, yes, exactly right.
Which is common.
Common, right,
then.
yeah, of course it was. Yeah, of course it was. But then as I grew into a young woman, I actually wanted to do more. I didn't want to work in factories. So I went back to school and I actually got a job in, believe it or not, when Joan Kerner was the Premier of Victoria. I actually, under her regime, she had what they called the NISA training program.
Yep.
And I actually got a traineeship under that program.
You started as a trainee.
Yeah, working in government as a trainee.
That's amazing. And now you are a CEO.
Yeah. But I mean, yes, I am. So I started off as a trainee, and I knew how important it was to have that education, both educations, our own education, growing strong in culture, but also having education from the system. Anyway, So I knew that was really important. So, and I took every opportunity when I did get in the public service, middle management courses, talking to elders. My mum was a big driver for me because she used to share her journey and her story when she was a young girl growing up on the mission.
Yep. When
she was a young girl trying to find employment, and the racism that was blatant. So I took my cue from my mother's experiences, so to speak. Yeah.
Yep. I know you were telling me that your mum went to school, I believe, at Framlingham.
Yes.
And that would have been a different experience to the experiences that you had.
Oh, very much
education. Yeah.
Very much so. My mum remembers when she remembers when what they had to write on was slate and a slate pencil.
Yep.
It was slate. So there was no paper or books or anything, it was slate. But she remembers it was only a little mission school at Fram, and she remembers she was in class, and by the way, back then it wasn't mandatory or compulsory for Aboriginal people to go to school.
Why not?
Well, because we weren't counted in the census, basically, until the 1967 referendum. Okay, so it wasn't. If you didn't want to go to school, you didn't have to go to school. But a lot of our elders knew the importance of understanding the modern world, so to speak, and the modern educational system. And knew that we needed both to be able to get a strong voice for Aboriginal people here in Victoria, for Aboriginal people right across this continent, by the way. So, but she told me not only about the slates and drawing, and I didn't know that, by the way, that was all news to me, but she told me about how the teachers at the time used to bring in not record play, what do you call those old gramophones? Is it a gramophone?
Yeah.
Yeah, that they'd play classical music.
On the gramophone?
On the gramophone.
During class?
Yeah, during class. So I actually don't know what that intent was. I can only assume what that intent was. But yes. So
would you assume it was about civilising?
Probably. I don't know. I just found it quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my mum, she did not only just go to the Framingham school, she went to other schools, mainstream schools. That's a little bit about me getting there. So I took up every opportunity I could as an Aboriginal woman to undertake education.
Yep.
So that I knew that's the only way I'm going to advance.
So you could move forward.
Yes, exactly.
Yep. And so this podcast is actually created as part of VACCHO's work in the cultural safety accreditation, and a large portion of it is to educate non-Aboriginal people about who we are and culturally safe practices. So I wanted to ask you about your definition, your personal definition of cultural safety and what it means to you, because we know that it originated from the New Zealand Maori fraternities, and we know that there's a 1999 article by Robin Williams, who is a medical professional, non-Aboriginal woman, and she wrote an article called Cultural Safety and What Does It Mean for Our Work Practice, and in that she defines cultural safety as an environment where there is no challenge or denial of who we are. It's about respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge, dignity and understanding. That's a really broad concept of it, though. Yeah. So what's your opinion of cultural safety? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, the term cultural safety did come from New Zealand. Prior to that, here in Victoria, we actually delivered what we called cultural awareness.
Yes.
And it wasn't what we have today. It was a lot different, by the way, and it was done pretty ad hoc. But my understanding of what cultural safety is, I mean, and what you quoted before, Beck, in relation to Robin Williams, I knew Robin Williams.
Okay.
Yeah, and she's spot on, but it's also about trying to address racism in the workplace.
Absolutely.
You know, racism, and we all know the impacts of racism on our health and well-being as a peoples. So it's really important that racism is addressed in the workplace. Discrimination, it's the same, you know, lateral violence, vicarious trauma.
Yes.
You know, I mean, that's really important. If you're the lone Aboriginal person working in a big organisation and you're the only Aboriginal employee,
yes,
the trauma that's placed on you to actually raise awareness around Aboriginal culture and people so that organisation can become cultural, that creates trauma for you as an individual.
Absolutely.
That we have to tell our stories over and over and over and over again. So, so to me, cultural safety is about making the workplace, any workplace, culturally safe for our people, free of racism and discrimination.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah. But I think also a spin-off from that is our history, Aboriginal history in this country, either prehistory or contact history or our shared history, it's not taught in schools.
No.
So the more we educate non-Aboriginal people about some of our prehistory, but also some of our shared history, and all the, the atrocities that were committed in this country in the name of colonisation. People need to be told that. People need to know that. It's so important for a country to tell the truth so that we can move on as one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when we deliver VACCHO's cultural safety training, we often get asked about why history is important, but we find that if you don't know the history, then you can't understand the why something is offensive. So for example, you know, a lot of people don't know that using certain terminology can create culturally unsafe spaces because that terminology isn't accepted today, whereas it was, say, 30 years ago. And so the history of who we are, as you've just pointed out, parts of it is so important to creating culturally safe practices. But I wondered if you could just go through a little bit the history of colonisation and if we could just unpack why it is so important.
In relation to the impacts that colonisation, and it depends who you talk to, by the way, in our mob, as you well know, Beck, whether the term is colonisation or invasion.
Yes.
You can refer to it as both. So, but the impacts of colonisation that we still feel today. So some of those impacts are, there were mass murders.
Yes.
We were disempowered. We weren't even seen as citizens of our own countries right across this continent. We were rounded up and put on missions, and it was illegal to speak your language. It was illegal to practice culture. That is a crime against humanity. And how that manifests today in a lot of our communities, that transgenerational trauma that our communities and our people and our families still experience, still exists. And all you have to do is to look at the statistics. You look at how we are overrepresented in the justice system. You look at how we're overrepresented in the child protection system. Believe it or not, we're the worst on the planet. We are in the child protection system. When you look at the level of poverty that still exists in our communities in the year 2022.
Yeah.
That's all leads up to transgenerational trauma. And that's
tracks back, yes.
Exactly right.
Absolutely.
It tracks back to all those policies, White Australian policy. It tracks back to we weren't even recognised as citizens until 1967. All tracks back to that. The disempowerment that our people have experienced for the past 200 years or 250.
Yep.
The disempowerment. You disempower a people that prior to colonisation, we had our own law people. We had our own medical practitioners. We had our own laws, our own politicians, our elders. We had all that.
Our own governance system.
Our own governance
agricultural
systems.
system,
We had the
yes.
lots. And then we had a group of people that came here and didn't ask us whether they could stay. And, I make jest of it, but at the end of the day, it is serious.
Absolutely. It's like, it's almost, you could almost say that it's like when you have a mate you haven't seen for a long time call you and say, can I come and stay for a week? And next minute they're still in your house for a year.
Exactly.
And they're unwanted and you're like, how do I tell you to leave?
Exactly right. So that disempowerment is, that can have long effects on your well-being as an individual, your well-being as a family, and your well-being as a community.
Absolutely. And we know that in 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement went viral and everyone started jumping on the bandwagon, but a lot of those people have since jumped off now that it's lost traction. But we know that we've been saying since 1788 in this country that Black Lives Matter.
Oh, of course.
And we've been having all kinds of protests and movements and peaceful protests.
Yeah.
The Tent Embassy is quite a peaceful protest and NAIDOC here in Melbourne is every year. But my question about that is, do you think that movements like Black Lives Matter, do you think movements like that can undermine our cultural safety?
Well, that's a very good question. I never thought of that, but I don't believe so. Look, we have many warriors in our community and we've had warriors for generations, through the generations since colonisation, We've had warriors who fought back or tried to fight back. We have people who fight today, but fight in different ways. You've got Aboriginal organisations who provide services. You've got Aboriginal peak organisations who try to provide a strong voice, but you still have to be careful because you are government funded. There will always be a need for, to be bold and to be brave and to call it out.
Yes.
And not accept status quo. So we'll always need our different warriors, whether it's labelled activism or I believe every Aboriginal person fights in their own way and is active in that activism space, but in different ways. But it's all for the same endpoint.
Yes, yes, all working towards the same end game, absolutely. Why is our history so important to cultural safety?
Why cultural safety is important, Beck? I think it's important for a number of reasons, apart from non-Aboriginal people, but the new migrants that come into this country, they don't get no history.
Yep.
Even in their immigration questions that they probably have to answer, and little things that they have to go through, there's nothing in there about the history here of this country when it comes to Aboriginal people. Yep. Either prehistory or shared history. So to me, that is a crime against humanity. That's the government should feel embarrassed about that.
Yep.
That our citizens, new citizens and old citizens, don't understand our shared history. So that's really important thing. Now, I know some time ago, I think we had a battle when governments tried to put VACCHO into the same barrel as the cold community.
Yes.
So that includes, all the migrants that come to this country. They tried to put Aboriginal people in as the called community. And a lot of very strong, powerful Aboriginal people piped up and said, well, no, that's not acceptable because you're talking about the first people of this country. We didn't migrate here.
That's right.
Okay, so that it's how important to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal lands.
Yes.
That's the importance. It's not about acknowledging all the cultures in this country that live on our continent in the year 2022. It is about acknowledging that there was a peoples here and a very rich, strong, powerful peoples that lived here before colonisation began.
Absolutely. And I think there's a history of dehumanising people when we start to put them into acronyms.
Yes.
So even that acronym COLD, it sounds cold, but it's culturally
it's
and
called,
linguistically diverse.
Yes.
Or we could just go with humans.
Yeah. Well, you could, but the point that I'm making in that is that our people and our cultures are different.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. And you mentioned earlier about the 1967 referendum, because what you're talking about now has made me think about it really is important that our current citizens and new people coming in do know the truth. So truth-telling is so important. And when we look at things like the 1967 referendum, which is quite often there's a common misconception that it gave us the vote, but that happened in 62. But I'm just thinking about when that referendum occurred, you and your mum were already... How old were you and your mum when the referendum occurred in 67?
You're asking me to use my brain on the spot to calculate.
Yeah,
I was born in 55, so from 55 to 67, how old would that make me?
12.
12? Okay, so 12 years old, so I was 12 years old.
And your mum would have been definitely at least pushing 30,
yes,
let's say.
Yes.
Close to 30.
Yes.
So in 1967, after 1967, you and your mum were then considered citizens of the country.
Exactly right.
But prior to 1967, you were not.
No, exactly right.
And that's what people don't know, that we still have people living today who at one point in this very country were not considered citizens of their own country.
Own country, exactly right. That's the point about the 67 referendum. I was born in 1955 where I was not recognised as a citizen.
And for the first 12 years of your life, you were not counted in the census.
Exactly.
Which I guess is why a lot of mob also feel as though we have always been classed as less than human in the country, and there is obviously some things in our history, such as, for example, many people wouldn't know either also that in Tasmania in 1828 they declared martial law against all surviving Aboriginal people, and it was, I believe it was £2 for an adult and £5 for a child. And it was shoot to kill.
Wow, exactly.
And
exactly.
That's not, like, we're not talking about animals there. We're not talking about culling the kangaroos because there's too many. We're talking about killing human beings.
Human beings.
And the law is supporting that with no ramifications for whoever is committing those murders. which we also know because that's also in our history.
Exactly.
And it's even documented under the massacres.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so,
That truth-telling is so important, because how can you know that someone may have a negative response to something like terminology, or even to, say, being in a situation where they're feeling dehumanised because they grew up and for the first 12 years of their life were not counted amongst the census with all of their primary school friends.
Exactly. Exactly. But can you imagine growing up? Can you imagine growing up in an era, in the era my mother was born into, and many other mothers were born in? It's just not about my mum. But can you imagine growing up where you weren't even seen as a human being, and you were rounded up, you were treated like animals?
Yes.
Rounded up and put on missions and told you're not allowed to speak your tongue. You're not allowed to practice your culture.
Not allowed to associate with family.
You're disempowered. Your Aboriginal people of mixed blood were taken away from their parents.
Yes.
Because the white Australian policy, you can assimilate and live amongst white fellas. That has a long-term effect on families and communities.
Aunt, thank you for taking the time today to sit with me and talk about cultural safety. I was wondering if, before we wrap up, I had 3 rapid fire questions for you, and I'm just going to ask you as one question. How does that sound?
Oh, that sounds deadly. Awesome.
Okay, so what I'd like to know is, what is your leadership style? Who inspires your leadership style? And what advice do you have for any young mob out there who want to move into leadership?
My leadership style, that's a very good question. My leadership style is about how do I empower others to have a voice, to have a strong voice. Who inspires my leadership style are people like Nelson Mandela, people like my mum, Frances Gallagher, Auntie Alma Thorpe, Uncle Banjo Clark, William Coopers. You know, they're all people who have really done a lot for Indigenous people around the world, but also Indigenous, our own people within Australia.
Yep.
My advice to up-and-coming young leaders out there in the community, be bold. Got to be bold.
Yep.
But be brave.
Yep.
Know your history.
Absolutely.
And have a very strong voice.